Now that Mewtwo is in the Tier 5 raid pool in Pokemon Go, we have noticed that there are some changes to Mewtwo compared to when it was an EX raid boss. For one, it's got bigger stats than usual, and for two, it's got 3 new attacks: Flamethrower, Ice Beam, and Thunderbolt. So the content that I did on Mewtwo before, slightly inaccurate, so I decided to update my Mewtwo content to reflect these changes. So let's get into it. So this is my old Mewtwo graph, all movesets averaged, and this is using the Tier 5 stats. So a lot of people are asking, well, how does this graph change with the Tier 6 higher stat Mewtwo? Well, it honestly doesn't change much at all. Going from this Tier 5 to this Tier 6 kind of Mewtwo, all that changes is Mewtwo's HP. So only the hit points change. So the only thing that changes on this graph is the total damage output. The scaling doesn't change between like the Pokemon to Pokemon, how good they are compared to each other. It's just the numbers on the bottom change because the total percent of damage that they're dealing to Mewtwo is going to be less. So yeah, this graph here reflects those changes. You might have to blink a bit. Aside from the red lines, literally nothing has changed. The scaling of the Pokemon are all the same. They're as far apart from each other as they've ever been. The breakpoints are the same. What has changed is at the bottom here, the numbers are different because you're dealing less percent of damage to Mewtwo because the amount of HP Mewtwo has is now much higher. Because Mewtwo's HP is higher and we're still on a 300-second timer, then the DPS you need in order to trio or quad it is now much higher. In fact, the duo DPS is so ridiculously high that I don't think it's possible. I haven't really looked in duos. All I saw was that it was like 31 DPS, and I'm like, okay, Shadowclaw Gengar's at 24, so I don't know if duos can happen with the new Mewtwo, and the trios are looking pretty hard too. So yeah, this is the trio line. With the higher HP, you need to be doing roughly 21 DPS in order to clear that with 3 people. You'll see that Tyranitar here, with an Ultra Friendship, no dodging, just barely makes it, but isn't quite there. And doing specific simulations on an all Tyranitar trio for the new Mewtwo raid boss, the Tier 6 one, I just don't think it's possible. Even with best friendship and ideal circumstances, if you're not getting a foggy weather boost, I don't think it's going to happen with Tyranitar. I don't really think it's going to happen with Psycho Cut Mewtwo itself. The only way you can really try to pull off a trio outside of having beneficial weather is with the Gengars. And even then it's a little bit flaky with the non-Shadow Claw ones. So this Mewtwo fight is definitely harder in that respect. As far as getting the quad in, definitely not that ridiculous. I'd say the current quads are probably as difficult as the old trios were. And if you're trying to do it with like 5 people or more, well then you're going to have a pretty easy time still with Mewtwo. So just some updates there on countering it. Going to be a harder raid boss. The counters are the same. The counters are as good compared to each other as they've ever been. Just a little bit more difficult. One thing I do want to point out about this graph is that I did not update it for the Flamethrower, the Ice Beam, and the Thunderbolt. Honestly, it doesn't change anything in any grandiose way. The only real changes I could think of is Mewtwo would probably look slightly better in terms of TDO, and Lugia might look slightly worse, right? Because you do lose the Shadow Ball. So that helps out Mewtwo. And there aren't any super effective hits hitting the Shadow Ball Mewtwo. So definitely a good news kind of situation for Mewtwo there. And Lugia also isn't getting hit by Shadow Ball, but now it has the potential to get hit by Ice Beam and Thunderbolt. They're not that strong, but they are super effective against Lugia, so Lugia would be slightly worse. Overall, for the majority of these Pokemon, I don't think it's a major change that really warrants making a whole new graph for it. So now we know how to fight this new Mewtwo, the Tier 6 Mewtwo, but how good are these new movesets? Well, I can tell you right off the bat that Flamethrower is kind of hot garbage. Yeah, you can take a hard pass on that. If you really want this illustrated to you, against the Regi raids, Regirock, Registeel, Regice, they're all weak to Focus Blast. And in all of those fights, Mewtwo was kind of like a suboptimal third-rate kind of Pokemon compared to anything else you could be using. Flamethrower isn't that much better than Focus Blast, and then you're also further limited to just Regice and, Registeel. But yeah, no, Flamethrower definitely isn't worth considering. Thunderbolt and Ice Beam, though, are pretty interesting. So got some info on that for you. You might recognize this graph from my Frenzy Plant Meganium content or my Grass Type Everything content, since there's probably a lot of Pokemon on here you don't recognize. But yeah, in that video, I decided to simulate a Solar Beam Mewtwo. Now, Solar Beam Mewtwo and Thunderbolt Mewtwo aren't all that different from each other in performance, so definitely still behind Raikou. Still arguably as good, if not better, than most of the grass types we currently have in the game in terms of DPS. But when you look all the way to the right, you still have Alolan Exeggutor with its immunity tier resistance to water type attacks, while also dealing the water type damage. And then to, a little extra spice, we got Gen 4's Tangrowth, Tangela's evolution, definitely being really good there. But as with anything that can hit water type super effectively, I think a good litmus test for how good they truly are is how they hold up against the Blizzard Kyogre Raid. So this graph is against Blizzard Kyogre, and it says Gen 4 predictions on it because I use this graph for my Raikou content. Link in the description to that video as well if you're interested in learning about these different electric type Pokemon from Gen 4. But yeah, so you can see here we got Thunderbolt Mewtwo, which is a pretty large step up from Shadow Ball Mewtwo. The DPS is way higher, the TDO is obviously higher, and Mewtwo can tolerate a Blizzard pretty well. It's still going to be behind Raikou overall in performance, and if the Gen 4 Pokemon come out before we get Kyogre again, and if they don't get the bad movesets, if they get the good movesets, namely Wild Charge or Thunderbolt having ones, well then they're probably going to edge out Mewtwo a little bit and make it, a little bit less of a worthy option to power up specifically for this raid. So overall, I think Mewtwo definitely looking pretty impressive with the Thunderbolt. Not everybody's swimming in Raikous, and Zapdos, it looks kind of bad here because it's up against Blizzard, but not everybody's swimming in Zapdos. Not everybody wants to power up a Zapdos when they could be powering up a Raikou. So if Kyogre comes back, and you don't have all these other electric type options for the raid, well then I'd say TM your Focus Blast or your Psychic Mewtwo's, but powering up a Mewtwo specifically for Thunderbolt, specifically for this raid, that might be not the most ideal way to spend your Stardust. Now what's a bit more interesting is Ice Beam Mewtwo. Yeah, it comes to no surprise that out of all the Pokemon that are currently in Pokemon Go, Ice Beam Mewtwo stands above all the other Ice-type Pokemon as an Ice-type attacker. The bar is set super crazy low. Articuno, Regice, super low attack stats, very good defenses, but not good attack stats. Mewtwo, very good defenses, and also really high attack stat. For example, when Mew first came out, this was before Regice came out, and before we had Smackdown Tyranitar. So yeah, when Mew came out, it was kind of debatable if Mew was the best Ice-type Pokemon, which is kind of ridiculous, because even though Mew does have some pretty general stats, its stats are technically better than Articuno's, and it could get a double Ice-type moveset. And so we were like, yeah, Mew might be the best Ice-type Pokemon, what? And yeah, with Regice kind of took back the throne, kind of, to a true Ice-type Pokemon. Well, Mewtwo just took it right back for Psychic types, with its Ice Beam, with its monster stats. So yeah, the bar set super crazy low for Ice types, being good as them. Mewtwo, right now, best Ice-type Pokemon. Now, you do see that there are these 3 Pokemon you might not be too familiar with, or 4. I actually put in Porygon Z on this graph with Ice Beam. I just really like Porygon Z. But yeah, so you got Weavile, Glaceon, and Mamoswine, which are all evolutions of Pokemon we currently have in the game, so they would very likely be easy to obtain early on in Gen 4. And of them, Weavile and Glaceon looking better in DPS, but worse in total damage output, and Mamoswine is just the authority on Ice-type Pokemon. Like, this guy thinks he's King of the North. No, King of the North right here, upper right-hand corner, Mamoswine, Mega God, Ice-type Pokemon right there. Now, looking at these Gen 4 predictive kind of Pokemon, like, that's all fine and good and all, but we do have Ice Beam Mewtwo right now. One thing I really kind of want to drive home to you guys, though, is we don't have a Rayquaza Raid right now. And to be perfectly honest, Rayquaza is the only raid boss in which you really would want to use Ice-type Pokemon in Pokemon Go. So this is the only raid where the Ice Beam Mewtwo really shows its stuff. You do have the Zapdos raid, but for Zapdos you have Smackdown Tyranitar and both flavors of Golem to compete with it. And you do have Lugia, but even that's like more flaky. So I'm not really seeing a whole lot of situations that are currently in the game or, have been in the game where this ice type DPS is really important. So might not be the best way to spend your Stardust right now since it's only useful in one raid. Now when the raid does come out, if Rayquaza comes back, when Rayquaza comes back, and we don't have these Gen 4 ice types, or maybe Niantic completely wrecked these Gen 4 ice types on their move pools, well then would be a good time to power up an Ice Beam Mewtwo or to TM a Psychic or Focus Blast Mewtwo you currently have to have Ice Beam for this fight. But powering it up right now, because it may be useful in the future, may be the best ice type for this raid in the future, I don't think that's being very frugal with your Stardust or your Rare Candy, depending on how you cut it. Now, don't let me stop you from powering up Ice Beam Mewtwo. It's certainly a great Pokemon, very good. I mean, here's one situation where it's better than all other ice types currently in the game. But, some of us don't have deep pockets of Stardust. So if you're looking to make a pretty sound investment, I would say look at what's currently going on in the game and what's going on in the near future and what's going on in the deep future in Pokemon Go. Right now, we got Mewtwo raids. So if you're wondering what should I spend my Rare Candy and Stardust on, Mr. Swag, well, I would probably recommend you to power up Mewtwo counters, such as Bite Crunch Tyranitar, Shadow Ball Mewtwo, Shadow Claw Gengar, Rayquaza, Dragonite. Very sound investments that are really good right now. Looking at the near future, we know that Deoxys is going to be in the EX raid pool. Deoxys is a Psychic type Pokemon. Actually, it's kind of weaker than Mewtwo, so it's going to be a very similar fight, unless Niantic throws some weird curveball on us. So very similar fight to what the Mewtwo raids are, or what the Mewtwo EX raids were. I don't know how Niantic's going to spice it up for us, but Bite Crunch Tyranitar, Shadow Claw Gengar, Shadow Ball Mewtwo, Rayquaza, Dragonite. I don't think there's a whole lot more you need to know beyond that. And then also looking deeper in the future to Gen 4, link in the description where I cover all the different raid bosses in Gen 4. A lot of them are Psychic type. One is actually a Ghost type. And these are all, once again, Pokemon that Bite Crunch Tyranitar kind of swags in. Shadow Ball Mewtwo, Shadow Claw Gengar. So powering up an Ice Beam Mewtwo isn't really going to help you out right now, isn't going to help you out in the next EX raid, and isn't really going to help you out in Gen 4. The only real use for Ice Beam Mewtwo, in my opinion, is in this Rayquaza raid. So when it comes out, I'd say make your Stardust spending happen then, and use it on what you think is a good investment then. But for now, probably not the best option. Another thing kind of working against Ice Beam Mewtwo, having it only really be useful for this Rayquaza raid, or optimally useful against this Rayquaza raid, is that using any of these other Ice-type Pokemon, like even Piloswine, not this big boy Mamoswine, but even Piloswine, is a really good option. This is one of the easiest raid bosses in Pokemon Go, so you could just use your trash tier Ice-type basic Pokemon and beat it as well as you would if you were to be using the premium Ice Beam Mewtwo. So for people that don't have deep pockets of Stardust, wondering, what should I waste my Stardust on today, Mr. Swagger? I guess spend my Stardust on. I don't think it's a waste of Stardust to power up Ice Beam Mewtwo. It's just, I don't know. I don't think it's all that useful, despite its prestige. And it's got some pretty stiff competition going forward in the future. So that's all I really have to say on the new Mewtwo raid and Mewtwo's new movesets. I'd say overall, Flamethrower, you can sleep on that. Thunderbolt and Ice Beam, both pretty interesting movesets, and they do have their niche uses. In fact, Ice Beam has an optimal use, right? But overall, when you really look at the grand scheme of things, none of the new Mewtwo movesets are really making waves in the meta. I don't think either of them are really worth the Stardust investment. That said, if you already have powered them up, or you do want to power up these new Mewtwo's, they are good options. I mean, they're good for the reasons why I said they're good. They're not the best Stardust investments for the reasons why I said they're not the best Stardust investments. Yeah. If you like this content, you want to see more like it, well then subscribe to Swag Tips. And if you got any questions on this content, maybe you want to show me up in some way, well, comment below, let me know what's up. And yeah, thanks for watching.